The incident began at Heathrow Airport's Terminal 5 on a busy Friday evening in November, when flights were delayed due to fog, and thousands of frustrated passengers crowded the departure lounges, creating the kind of tense atmosphere where small problems escalate quickly and where people's true characters are revealed under pressure. And Ronaldo was sitting quietly in the business class lounge, trying to avoid attention while waiting for his delayed flight to Madrid, when he witnessed something that would force him to choose between maintaining his privacy and intervening in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control, just 20 meters away from where he sat. The family at the center of the disturbance consisted of Omar al-Rashid, a Syrian refugee who had been living in London for 3 years while working as a hospital translator, his wife Fatima, who wore a traditional hijab and spoke limited English, and their twin 8-year-old daughters Layla and Yasmin, who were excited about their first airplane trip to visit relatives in Germany. But what should have been a routine security screening had turned into a prolonged ordeal that was attracting the attention of other passengers and creating the kind of scene that airport security personnel are trained to handle quickly, but were instead allowing to escalate through a combination of cultural insensitivity and bureaucratic inflexibility that treated the family's confusion as suspicious behavior rather than a natural response to excessive and seemingly arbitrary scrutiny. The problems had started when Omar's wife had been asked to remove her hijab for additional screening, a request that she had initially complied with despite her obvious discomfort. But when the female security officer conducting the search had made loud comments about these people and their unwillingness to follow proper procedures in front of other passengers, the situation had moved beyond routine security protocols into the realm of public humiliation that seemed designed more to demonstrate authority than to address any legitimate safety concerns that could have been handled discreetly and respectfully. Ronaldo watched as Omar tried to explain in his careful English that his family was happy to comply with all security requirements, but requested that his wife's additional screening be conducted in private rather than in full view of dozens of other passengers who were now staring and whispering, some with sympathy, but others with the kind of suspicion and hostility that made it clear they viewed the family's presence as an inconvenience at best and a threat at worst. And when Omar's reasonable request was dismissed with barely concealed contempt by security personnel, who seemed to be enjoying their power to embarrass and delay people who couldn't effectively fight back, Ronaldo felt his own anger building as he recognized the familiar pattern of discrimination disguised as security protocol. The twin girls had begun to cry as they sensed their parents' distress and confusion, their excitement about their first flight replaced by fear and shame as they watched their mother being subjected to increasingly invasive and public screening procedures while their father was questioned about their travel plans with the kind of aggressive skepticism typically reserved for suspected criminals, rather than a family taking a vacation to visit relatives. And when one of the security officers made a comment about breeding terrorists, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, several people laughed nervously while others looked away in embarrassment, but no one spoke up to challenge behavior that everyone recognized as inappropriate and discriminatory. It was at that moment, when Omar's dignity was being systematically destroyed in front of his children and wife, while dozens of people watched in silence, that Ronaldo stood up from his seat and walked purposefully toward the security checkpoint, his movement immediately noticed by other passengers who recognized him and began pulling out phones to record what they sensed might become a significant confrontation between one of the world's most famous athletes and airport security personnel who were clearly overstepping their authority in their treatment of a vulnerable family. "Excuse me?" Ronaldo said as he approached the security checkpoint, his voice calm, but carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the area stop what they were doing and pay attention. "I couldn't help but notice that this family is being treated very differently from other passengers, and I'm wondering if you could explain the security concerns that require this level of public scrutiny for a man traveling with his wife and young children." And the security supervisor, A middle-aged woman with sergeant stripes, who had been overseeing the harassment with obvious approval, suddenly found herself facing someone whose presence transformed the entire dynamic of the situation. The supervisor's initial response revealed both her surprise at being challenged and her assumption that even celebrities would eventually back down when confronted with official authority. "Sir, this is a security matter, and we need to ask you to return to your seat while we complete our procedures." But Ronaldo didn't move, instead stepping closer to the family to make it clear that he was not just a casual observer, but someone who was prepared to involve himself directly in what was happening. And when Omar looked up with tears of gratitude in his eyes, Ronaldo placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You're not alone in this. These people are representing all of us badly, and what's happening to your family is not acceptable." The transformation in the security team's behavior was immediate and revealing, their aggressive posture shifting to nervous deference as they realized they were now conducting their discriminatory screening under the scrutiny of someone with the influence to make their behavior a global news story. But Ronaldo was not interested in watching them perform better behavior for the cameras. He was interested in understanding why they had felt comfortable humiliating a refugee family in the first place, and what systematic changes needed to be made to prevent other families from facing similar treatment when they didn't have a celebrity advocate to protect them. "This gentleman and his family have been standing here for 45 minutes, Ronaldo continued, his voice growing stronger as he gained momentum. "They have cooperated with every request, answered every question, submitted to searches that other passengers are not required to undergo, and yet you continue to treat them as threats rather than travelers. And I want to know what specific security concerns justify this level of scrutiny for a hospital translator traveling with his wife and 8-year-old daughters to visit family members in Germany." And the silence that followed his question made it clear that there were no legitimate security concerns, only prejudice and power being exercised against people who were perceived as unable to defend themselves. The crowd that had gathered around the security checkpoint included passengers from dozens of countries, many of whom had experienced similar discrimination themselves or witnessed it happening to others. And when Ronaldo asked them directly whether they thought the Al-Rashid family was being treated fairly, a chorus of voices spoke up to say that they had been watching the harassment for nearly an hour and were disturbed by what they had witnessed, but hadn't known how to intervene effectively. And their collective testimony about the discriminatory treatment they had observed created additional pressure on security personnel who could no longer pretend that their behavior had been professional or appropriate. The airport's senior security manager arrived within minutes, alerted by subordinates who realized that their discriminatory treatment of a refugee family was about to become an international incident that would reflect poorly on the entire airport authority. And when he saw Ronaldo standing protectively beside the Al-Rashid family, while dozens of passengers documented the confrontation on their phones, he immediately understood that damage control required not just ending the current harassment, but acknowledging that it should never have begun and taking steps to ensure it wouldn't happen again. "Mr. Ronaldo, I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced," the manager began, but Ronaldo cut him off immediately. "I haven't experienced any inconvenience, but this family has experienced systematic harassment disguised as security screening, and your apology should go to them, not to me, because I'm not the one whose dignity has been attacked and whose children have been traumatized by the unprofessional behavior of your staff." And the manager's attempt to treat the situation as a customer service issue rather than a civil rights violation revealed exactly the kind of institutional thinking that allowed discrimination to flourish under the cover of official procedures. The resolution of the immediate situation involved the Al-Rashid family being expedited through security with the kind of respectful treatment they should have received from the beginning. But Ronaldo made it clear that he was not satisfied with simply solving their individual problem. He wanted to understand what training and oversight procedures were supposed to prevent this kind of discrimination, and what systematic changes would be implemented to ensure that other families wouldn't face similar treatment when they didn't have celebrity advocates to protect them from prejudiced security personnel who viewed their authority as licensed to humiliate people they perceived as foreign or threatening. The conversations that followed in the airport manager's office included not just immediate disciplinary actions against the security personnel involved, but broader policy discussions about cultural sensitivity training, bias recognition programs, and oversight mechanisms that would make discriminatory behavior more difficult to practice and easier to identify and punish when it occurred. And while Ronaldo understood that real change would require sustained pressure rather than single interventions, he also knew that high-profile incidents could create momentum for reforms that might otherwise take years to implement. Omar al-Rashid, who had spent 3 years in London trying to rebuild his family's life after fleeing war in Syria, found himself overwhelmed not just by Ronaldo's intervention but by the public support that followed. As passengers who had witnessed the discrimination offered their contact information as witnesses, and several legal organizations reached out to discuss potential civil rights complaints that could address not just this individual incident, but the broader patterns of discrimination that refugee families faced when traveling. And for the first time since arriving in Britain, he felt that the country's promises of equality and respect might actually apply to people like his family. The media coverage that followed focused initially on Ronaldo's role in defending the family, but the deeper story that emerged was about the systematic discrimination faced by Muslim and refugee families in airport security settings, the inadequate training and oversight that allowed prejudiced personnel to use official procedures as cover for harassment, and the broader cultural climate that made such discrimination feel acceptable to perpetrators who assumed their behavior would be supported or at least ignored by authorities and bystanders who preferred not to get involved in uncomfortable confrontations. The al-Rashid family's flight to Germany was delayed by several hours, but when they finally boarded their plane, they carried with them not just the trauma of harassment, but also the knowledge that someone had been willing to stand up for them when they couldn't effectively defend themselves, and their daughters Layla and Yasmin, who had started the day excited about their first airplane trip, ended it with a complex lesson about prejudice and advocacy that would influence their understanding of justice and moral courage for the rest of their lives. 6 months later, when airport authorities invited Ronaldo to participate in a ceremony announcing new cultural sensitivity training programs for security personnel, he insisted that Omar al-Rashid be included as a speaker who could explain from personal experience how discriminatory treatment affected families and communities. And Omar's presentation about the psychological impact of being treated as a threat in front of his children became one of the most powerful elements of the training program that was eventually implemented across the UK airport system. The incident at Heathrow became a case study in how individual interventions by people with influence could create opportunities for systematic change, but also how such change required sustained pressure and institutional commitment rather than just celebrity involvement. And while Ronaldo's intervention had protected one family and sparked important policy discussions, the broader work of eliminating discrimination required ongoing vigilance from travelers, advocates, and officials who understood that equality was not automatically achieved through policies and procedures, but required constant effort to ensure that official authority was exercised fairly and respectfully, regardless of travelers' backgrounds, religions, or countries of origin.